This next progression now builds on many of the concepts we've worked on so far, while adding a few new ones. Here we have a progression in the key of C minor that, at times, uses the sharp 6th and sharp 7th from C melodic minor, as well as a flat 5th, all of which you should be pretty familiar with at this point. However, now we're also bringing in a flat 2nd at one point. Take advantage of that Locrian or Hungarian minor style, what you might consider a more Eastern mystical sound. This progression also takes that idea of using the root chord as something other than the home chord to a new degree. In fact, there isn't a single point in the progression where a full resolution is felt on the root C minor arpeggio. It's always being used as a transitory stopping point that builds momentum towards the next part. We don't even start with it, instead starting with the dominant 7th arpeggio. But that doesn't mean that this progression deprives us entirely of a tonal center. Actually, not at all. It's simply that the root chord as a home chord is not present in the progression. If you were to just strum a C minor chord after the last measure of this progression, you'd find the full sense of resolution you'd normally expect. In this progression, we also bring in a C minor major 6 add 9 arpeggio, as well as a D sharp add 11 and a number of 7th arpeggios. This progression has an ongoing sense of tension that never quite resolves. It has an open-ended, almost endless loop feeling to it that nearly makes us forget about resolution entirely as it keeps pushing us to the next part again and again. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the first section here uses the dominant 7th arpeggio, and of course that would be G7 in the key of C minor. In this case, the whole section is made up of a 4-string pattern. We use the 4th finger to slide up to a higher position of G7, and then again to slide back down. As always, this slide is not an aesthetic choice, but a pragmatic one. It allows for the most comfortable expression of these notes, while efficiently setting us up for the next part, and so on. You'll notice that, in the context of the progression, even though we're starting with a major arpeggio, we're never really fooled into thinking the progression is in a major key. The 7th in the G7 helps with that quite a bit, since no major key has a minor 7th interval on the root chord. To help with that, if we were in a major key, then we'd know that G7 is the dominant 7th of C major. So when we move directly to C minor, as we do in the next part, this immediately clarifies that we're in a minor key. Another thing that helps is the fact that we've actually been conditioned not to judge whether a song's in major or minor yet by simply hearing one 7th chord or arpeggio. Now we come to the root C minor chord for the first time. We don't get the feeling of resolution from this transition, and the C minor merely pushes us forward, helping to escalate the feeling of tension in the overall progression. From the first part of the pattern, we slide with the 1st finger from 5th to 8th position, and go immediately into a rolling bar on the first 3 strings with the 1st finger. Sliding into a rolling bar can be fairly challenging at first, and you'll probably need to spend some extra time working on it. Thankfully, sliding into an ascending rolling bar is much easier than sliding into a descending one. So in this case, you just need to use the top part of your 1st finger for the slide, and that will position you perfectly for the rolling bar, using the rest of the finger. For the last 3 notes, we switch to the C minor 9 in the same fashion as we did in progression 8. The transition from the G7 in the previous section to C minor in this one doesn't simply tell us that we're in the key of C minor, but it actually indicates that we're in C harmonic minor, since the sharp 7 of harmonic minor is found in the dominant 7th chord, G7. We effectively have enough context at this point to assume that C is our tonal center, and also that we're not simply working in a mode of C minor. The fact that we started on the G7 creates an impression that we came into this progression midway. This adds to the tension, and the specific pattern of C minor, after the specific pattern of G7, seems to indicate that we're in the middle of an ongoing escalation. So any sense of resolution here feels incomplete. Adding the 9th at the end of this measure increases tension even further right before we transition again. This next part uses both a D diminished seventh arpeggio and a G7 arpeggio. This is again a switch from the diminished seventh chord of harmonic minor to the dominant seventh chord of the same. This time, the transition is emphasized by the fact that it happens on an off beat. On the beat, we end the D diminished seventh arpeggio on the A flat before walking down a half step to begin the G7 arpeggio with the G. D diminished seventh is made up of the notes D, F, A flat, and B. G7 is made up of G, B, D, and F. So the only difference between them is the fact that one of them has an A flat, and in the place of that, the other one has a G. So by lowering the A flat by 1/2 step to a G, we transition from D diminished seventh to G7 without changing any of the other notes of the arpeggio. The B in both of these arpeggios is the sharp 7 of C harmonic minor. In C natural minor, it's a B flat, so this B is a B natural accidental. Now would be a good time to point out what makes the transition between the diminished seventh to the dominant seventh so effective. The diminished seventh contains 2 flat fifth intervals, or 2 tritones, and these are considered to be the most tense or dissonant intervals there are. The dominant seventh arpeggio contains 1 perfect fifth, which is very comfortable sounding, very consonant, and 1 tritone, again, dissonant and tense. So when we change the A flat to the G, by bringing it down 1/2 step, we're actually changing what was a tritone into a perfect fifth. This gives us a very clear sense of moving from dissonance to consonance, but it continues with maybe half as much tension because we still have that 1 tritone in the dominant seventh. Note that we use a slide with the second finger to shift positions to set ourselves up for the G7 arpeggio. This next section uses the root C minor again, and now moves to a C minor major 6 add 9 arpeggio. We've discussed this enough now, so I'll just point out that again, while we're technically resolving back to the root chord, we don't get the feeling of resolution. The C minor major 6 add 9 may seem unusual, but you'll hear in the full composition how it works. It should be noted that when I was writing this, I didn't decide to use a C minor major 6 add 9, or even try to use it. Instead, I wrote the composition melodically by ear and then worked out what arpeggio the notes fell into afterwards. In a sense, thinking of it as a C minor major 6 add 9 is a little strange, since it's simply grouping the melodic notes together and labeling them as a chord. But in the context of the composition, being an arpeggio progression, it certainly is a C minor major 6 add 9. The major 6 now falls into C melodic minor, and that's extremely common for classical and neoclassical styles. The major 6th here is an A natural, since the minor 6th of C natural minor is A flat. Of course, the 9th interval we have here fits into natural, harmonic, or melodic minor, and isn't really unusual at all. Pay attention to the tension created by the very last note of this measure, which is the 9th. It's pulling us directly into the next part, with some force. This section uses an F minor and moves to an F7 at the end. Notice the descending jump from the 13th fret on the first string with the 4th finger down to the 10th fret of the 3rd string. We'll then be using the 2nd finger for a rolling bar on the 10th frets of the 3rd and 4th strings. A little later, we have another rolling bar with the 1st finger on the 8th frets of the 5th and 6th strings. When we change to F7 for the last 3 notes, we'll now be palm muting the ascending sweep. This palm muting foreshadows the final 4 measures of the progression. We ended the last section with the 9th of C minor, and that created additional tension that most notably draws us back to the C note. So even though we're now transitioning to an F minor arpeggio, the first note we play is the C that the end of the last section was pulling us to, since the C note is shared by both the C minor and F minor chords. Immediately afterwards, we continue with the rest of the F minor arpeggio, which sort of clarifies that we are in F minor now. F minor appears naturally in the key of C minor, and it uses the minor sixth of C minor, which is an A flat, as the minor third of F. So we've changed from melodic minor in the last arpeggio to natural or possibly harmonic minor on the F minor. That way, when we move to the F7 at the end, it's clear that we're going back into melodic minor, since we've raised the minor third of F minor, the A flat, to a major third, or A natural. Again, the A flat is the minor sixth of C natural minor, with the A natural being the major sixth of C melodic minor. So the F minor chord fits into C natural minor or harmonic minor, and the F major chord fits into melodic minor. For the next part, we'll be using a D7 arpeggio on all 6 strings. Notice that we're making another descending jump now, similar to how the measure started in exercise 81. In exercise 81, we were descending a 5th interval with the jump. Now we're descending a major 6th. This is a particularly awkward jump since we're using the 4th finger on fret 14 on the 1st string, and then the 2nd finger for fret 10 on the 2nd string. As you progress through this section, you'll see the utility of that awkward fingering. This is a prime example of having the guitar work serve the music. There's an unlimited number of ways to play a D7 arpeggio, and it would have been much easier to phone it in here and just find the closest notes within the arpeggio and play those instead. But this is a composition where every note serves a specific purpose. So instead of cutting corners in the composition just to make it easier to play, we have to spend a little extra time working on an unusual finger reach so that the piece can be played as it was meant to be. For the D7, it should be clear to you that it's not a natural chord for either C natural, harmonic, or melodic minor. In the key of C minor, we'd have a D diminished chord. C harmonic minor would also have D diminished, now with the option of making it a D diminished 7th. And for C melodic minor, it would be just a regular D minor chord. To get the D7 in the key of C minor, we need the sharp 6th of melodic minor for the 5th, but we also need a flat 5th of C to get the major 3rd. So we can look at the D7 as simply using accidentals, or as a borrowed chord from another key. This part marks a significant change in the progression. In a sense, these last 4 measures we're getting started on now work as a new progression that would be the next part of the overall composition. In context, you'll see what I mean. Here we're using palm muting for all of the notes except for the ones that fall on the last string played per arpeggio. We also have 2 distinct arpeggios now in each measure until we get to the last measure where it has just one final arpeggio. For the first of these measures, we have a G and G7. This isn't the first time we've had to skip strings with the pick in this progression, but now we're skipping 3 strings to transition from the G to the G7. The G arpeggio ends with a hammer-on, and that buys us some time for the picking hand to reposition. But the G7 doesn't, which will make for a more difficult transition when going from this section to the next one. Continuing now to the next part, we have a D flat add 11 and a D diminished 7. The D flat add 11 is particularly interesting because D flat is a minor second of C. This gives it a distinctly Eastern sound and is reminiscent of some Romantic era classical music. The added 11th note also emphasizes this effect, as complex harmony of this type became considerably more common in classical music at that time. When we move to the D diminished 7th, we're coming back to the notes of C harmonic minor now, but this time with the dissonance of the diminished seventh. This continues that open-ended feeling and the momentum driving the arpeggios to each transition. Watch the fingering carefully on this section. When we go up to the 8th fret of the 2nd string, we counterintuitively use the 3rd finger where you'd expect to use the 2nd finger. This is to keep the 2nd finger free since we need it for the very next note as we jump down to start the D diminished 7th arpeggio. Now we move to a G and back to D diminished 7th again. While we aren't using the 7th of the dominant 7th chord here, the G and D diminished 7th still have a similar affinity for each other, and that's based on their shared notes and their positions in the scale. But also, we've already introduced both the G7 and a transition between D diminished 7th and G7. So our ears are primed to hear the G as serving a similar purpose to the G7 in this regard. Notice that the hammered-on note at the end of both of these arpeggios offer us a little reprieve from the challenging string skipping. The last section of this progression is actually the easiest of all of them. Here, we've simply returned to a G arpeggio, and this one is extremely similar to the one from exercise 85. This time we use a slide on the 3rd string to take us from the 4th fret to the 7th fret, and that uses the 1st finger. This is to reach the final note of the progression, a G found on the 8th fret of the 2nd string, and that uses the 2nd finger. After that, we have a rest, and the progression is over. Ending on a G in this way gives no sense of completion, and it leaves us with a very open-ended sound. You could just end it there and use it as a deceptive cadence. It does, fit the general feeling of the overall progression. You could also repeat the progression from the beginning or end on a C minor chord, which is basically what everything seems to be telling us to expect. There's not really a lot more to say about this one, so let's put the full progression together.